Hello and welcome to Coronavirus Catch Up. I'm Jordan Kenny. We're live tonight on the BBC News NI website and Facebook page and also on the BBC iPlayer for the next 20 minutes or so. Thanks for tuning in, however you're joining us. Well, it's been a busy week so far. On Tuesday, a day later than expected, the Executive published its plan for how Northern Ireland will exit the COVID-19 lockdown. Michelle O'Neill described that plan as cautious and hopeful, but Arlene Foster has admitted that it's not perfect. If you were expecting our lockdown plan to look similar to England's, which of course came with dates attached to each step, you'll have noticed that that wasn't the case. NI's blueprint doesn't contain any dates. Instead, we've been told by ministers that it will be led by data. Now, you've had lots of questions about this. We've been getting questions sent in from you all week. So joining me tonight to talk about Northern Ireland's lockdown exit plan and answer those questions is our political reporter, Jane McCormick, and our business reporter, Richard Morgan, who join me live from their houses. Hi guys, how are you?
Hi Jordan, good, thanks.
Thanks for coming on. Well, we'll just get straight into it. We've had this question in from Mary. I'm going to put it to both of you, but we'll start, Jane, with you first. And she's just asking, in plain English, what is going on?
Right, I will try and keep this as simple as I can. So I think it's worth pointing out that we are now in week 10 of the lockdown that came into effect on Boxing Day. Hard to believe at times that we've made it this far. We know that the restrictions had been extended until the 5th of April, but then earlier this week, as you said, Jordan, we got this recovery pathway blueprint from the Executive that kind of sets out where we might be going. I think a lot of people felt quite underwhelmed by it because they were hoping that it would be a roadmap similar to what people in other parts of the UK got. Ultimately, we didn't get that. It's more of a general guide as to where we might be going with all of this. Now, Richard can talk a bit more about kind of the business reaction because you mentioned there haven't been any dates. I think the other big criticism of it was that if people didn't think they were going to get indicative dates, they at least thought that there might be some sort of trigger points within the plan for those various 5 steps of how we would move out of step 1, which is lockdown, and right through step 2, 3, 4, and ultimately to the 5th step, which is all about what they say, preparing for the future. So it's hoped that by the time we get to step 5, things are looking an awful lot like they used to before COVID. But at the moment, we're not really that much clear as to how we're going to get there or when we're going to get there. And that is the problem.
Well, Richard, in the business world, in plain English, what's going on? We had the budget announced this week.
Yeah, well, if I just pick up on the point that Jane made there about the fact that we don't have dates in this exit strategy, it's frustrated a lot of businesses and a lot of business organizations. They've said that they're disappointed because they just don't know when they may open and how they can plan. They need advance notice to order stock, to try and get their workers back if they have people on furlough, and just to plan for the future. So real frustration among business groups that there's no dates. And they're also saying that, well, you haven't given us dates, so we don't know when we're going to be able to operate and trade again. So alongside that, we are going to need financial support. And the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, this week in his budget, he announced that furlough would be extended until the end of September, and that help for the self-employed would also be extended. But also hundreds of thousands of self-employed across the UK who missed out on support throughout the course of the pandemic, they will also be eligible for financial help too. Now, that is running until the end of September, which tells us that the government is expecting that the pandemic will have an impact on business for some time yet. But it is worth noting that over the summer, businesses will start to have to contribute more money towards paying for the furlough scheme, so it will come at a cost. Many will be keen just to be open, trading again, and have their staff back working.
Well, that's a quick upsum of where we're at the minute with everything. But before we go any further, let's just briefly take a quick look at the latest coronavirus figures for Northern Ireland from the Department of Health. 3 more people have died after testing positive for COVID-19 in the last 24 hours. The death toll now stands at 2,066. A further 163 positive cases have been reported. That means there has now been 113,163 positive COVID-19 cases in Northern Ireland. There are 257 people being treated for the virus in hospitals here. 29 are in intensive care units and 27 are on ventilators. The reproduction number, or R number, as you might know it, is down again. It's now sitting at between 0.65 and 0.75. And on vaccines, 596,860 doses of a COVID-19 vaccine have now been given out in Northern Ireland. Of that number, 556,721 are first doses. 40,139 people have had both their first and second jab of the vaccine. So, Jane, those numbers are moving in the right direction. They're down even from this time last week. We can notice a difference. One thing we keep hearing from ministers is that we will be led by data and not by dates when it comes to easing the lockdown restrictions here. And we've had a lot of questions about that in particular this week. Christine is asking, why can't ministers give us these dates for the lockdown restrictions being eased?
I think they would like to, but when you speak to them, and we've heard a lot from the likes of Robin Swann, the Health Minister this week, and Michelle O'Neill and Arlene Foster, the First and Deputy First Ministers, and the point that they're making is that ultimately to put indicative dates into this plan would ultimately be setting people up for false hope and potentially disappointment if further down the line we can't open up whenever they've told businesses that they can. So that's one element of it, is that they don't want people getting their hopes up only to be disappointed. I think the other part of all of this is that what they're saying is ultimately they're going to be led by the data. Now, that's frustrated some people in that there's not really an awful lot of that in the plan, but some of the factors you talked about there with hospital admissions, the R number, new cases, all of that is being taken into account by ministers on a regular basis. And Arlene Foster was pretty clear the other day that if the executive can move sooner to lift some of the restrictions rather than sticking to these review periods that we know are coming up, with the first one in just over a week's time on the 16th of March, then they will move to do that. So it's not necessarily about trying to hold out and not being transparent with the public in their view. They feel it's about trying to look at all of this in the round, because they've also got to consider the economic factors, societal factors as well, and ultimately to try and go slowly, because the last thing that anybody wants is to come out of lockdown to end up having to go back into it a short time later. We know that that's what happened before Christmas when the restrictions were eased. I think ministers have learned from that, albeit we know that the DUP has said that if it had just been them and the executive, this would have been a different plan. Now, what they mean by that, we're not entirely sure, because there was no vote around the executive table on bringing dates into the plan. I think there is some unease within some members of the DUP that they still would like dates to be in it, but ultimately we're not there yet. I think we will start to see some dates maybe after Easter, whenever things are in an even better position.
Well, you mentioned the word hope there, Jane. Neil's been in touch with us. He says he feels like the plan doesn't give him much hope. And he says he feels like it's just 45 different steps for easing lockdown, but obviously without dates or criteria. Are there any targets we have heard of from ministers that they would need to meet in order for them to start easing the restrictions or start moving through the steps?
No, and I think they have tried to veer away from that, because again, similar to putting the indicative dates in, I think there is a sense that if they come out and say, well, once we reach X amount of the population being vaccinated, we can all of a sudden lift these restrictions. We know that very quickly the situation can change with coronavirus, and ministers have talked quite a lot in recent days about how even if all of those factors around the R number and hospital admissions come down, the new variant could become a real concern, because if they lift restrictions and all of a sudden you see a spike in cases, it could be to do with some of these new variants that have managed to get into Northern Ireland. So they're worried about that. At the same time, I think they know that they have to provide hope to people, and I think they've recognised that there has been frustration on the ground with not giving people a real timetable for this. So I don't think it's that they are ignoring the frustration that they've gone through this lockdown like everybody else, but I think their focus after Easter really is going to have to be about how we really do start to get out of this. And we know next week in particular, the executive is going to talk more about the plan for schools, because obviously for Monday we've got the first kind of group P1s to P3s going back. So that'll be, I think, the test as to how the first lifting of some restrictions goes and what effect that has on everything, because they've talked about going slowly, lifting one restriction at a time, stepping back, seeing the effect that has before moving forward again. So pick your adjectives: slow, careful, cautious. That's what they're sticking to at the minute, and I think they're hopeful that things will change.
Well, as you'd expect, there's been lots of reaction to this, and Simon has got in touch with us. He says the executive need to accept that life is not risk-free and never can be. He wants everything opened up. But then Laura has also been in touch, and she says she's wanting the executive to hold their nerve and not give in to those who want to open up too early. Ministers are in a difficult position here. There's people on one side, people on the other. It's not an easy position to be in.
No, it's not. And I don't think anybody in the executive wants, things to be risk-free. They're not saying that. They absolutely recognise that there are risks with everything in life, but they know from past experience that when it comes to lifting restrictions, they did it too quickly before Christmas. And I think we all paid a very high price for that, given that we are now into the 10th week of lockdown, as I mentioned, and we're still not through that yet. We know that the pressure on hospitals in January was incredibly tough. So they are hoping, I think, that they can get everything back to as low a base as possible and then start to open up in a sustainable way. And I think for the long term, that's probably what businesses want more than anything else. And Richard can tell you more about that. But the sense that you get is that nobody wants to be going back into another lockdown. Everybody hopes that we can come out of it the right way this time.
Well, Richard, tell us, what has the reaction been in the business world to this exit plan? Like, how have businesses like bars and restaurants and those non-essential shops, how have they been reacting to this?
Well, there has been real frustration and disappointment from many business organisations whenever this exit strategy was published. They felt that there wasn't enough direction or notice of when they may even get a sense of reopening or when they can reopen. And from speaking to business owners and business organisations this week, they're aware that this is a tough balancing act for the executive, that they have to protect the health service, protect us all from the virus, but also protect the economy and protect jobs and livelihoods. So what they have said is, look, we just want to know when we can reopen, even an indicative date, some sort of timing. But also, as Jane mentioned, they also want to know that when they reopen this time, that they will be reopening for good and that they won't be closing again a couple of weeks or a couple of months later, because that comes at great cost too, particularly the hotel sector telling me earlier in the week on Good Morning Ulster that the reopening at Christmas cost tens of thousands of pounds for each venue, and then they had to close again, and it was just a point of real frustration for owners who had stock go to waste or had to reschedule bookings, cancel bookings. They lost money. So I think it's a sense of, give us some sort of idea of when we can reopen, but make sure that it is going to be the grand reopening, that once we reopen, that is it. We will not close again and enter further lockdowns.
Well, just a reminder, if anyone's watching on Facebook, to get involved in the comment section there. If you have any thoughts or questions about what's being discussed, leave them in there. I'm just seeing we've a couple questions in about caravans. We'll be chatting about travel in a minute or two, but just before we do, Jane, you mentioned it already. Monday is the 8th of March. We're going to see some changes from that date. So children in primaries 1 to 3, they'll be back in classrooms. But there's also a change to the number of people who can meet up outdoors. So from Monday, 10 people from a maximum of 2 households are allowed to meet in a public place. Julie has pointed out that this is in step 2 of the home and community section of the lockdown exit plan. So she's asking if that means if 6 people from 2 households can meet up in a garden, because that's also in step 2.
I think that's a fair question. However, what ministers are telling us is that even though part of step 2 will begin from that date, they've already made it clear that we won't enter step 2 for everything. So think of it as kind of like a pick and mix, and they will assess the data and pick out the activities they feel bring the least risk and sign those off. So we know that they've already agreed that from Monday, that's right, gatherings in a public place like in a park or wherever, you'll be allowed to meet in groups of 10 from 2 households, but that isn't going to extend to gardens at this time. I think meeting up with family and friends in back gardens is probably going to have to wait a little while yet until the executive meets for that first official full review of the restrictions on the 16th of March. And I can understand why people might be confused about that, and I think it's on ministers to make very clear how they see this plan going, because even when you read through the detail of the pathway document, it doesn't really show things moving in a linear fashion, and there's no real sense of why they've picked the things that they have. But what we understand is they're trying to pick the things that are the least risky while allowing people to build up a little bit more contact with family and friends. And they told us their priorities are schools, which we know already are going back for a certain limited number of groups from Monday. Then obviously after that's going to be family, friends, contact. And then after that, they're talking about outdoor activities and retail. So they've set out some of their priorities, but not all of it is going to happen at the same time. It's going to be a little kind of like a drip feed, I think, of restrictions being eased over the next while, slowly, carefully, cautiously, to see what effect all of that has together on the R number.
Well, obviously, everyone will have a particular area that they themselves will be interested in. We've had this question in from Gareth, and it's about driving instructors. And he says, in the retail section of the lockdown exit plan, driving instructors are allowed to return to work in step 2. However, household mixing indoors is not allowed until step 3. He's asking, can 2 people from different households share a car once driving lessons resume, or do we have to wait until household mixing resumes before we can do that? Richard, what's happening there?
Yeah, so as Jane said, just because one step in a certain plan has come into effect, it doesn't necessarily mean we will be in the same step in the other sections. So we could be at plan 2 or step 2 in the retail close contact services, but in terms of the social element, we could be one behind, or we could be a few in front. I think there's a real keenness and a real want from ministers to get driving tests going again, to get people out there learning to drive again, because there's a real backlog in the system. Because remember, all those tests that were cancelled last year, they all have to be dealt with, and then more teenagers will have come of age. They'll be wanting to learn how to drive, they'll be wanting to get their test booked. So while that can happen, I would say that if you spoke to ministers, or if you went through the regulations, and although it doesn't say this specifically, you will probably find that being in a car with somebody else is breaching the rules in terms of household mixing, except for in those circumstances or those exemptions, such as whether or not you're in a bubble with said person, or if it is for caring responsibilities, or in fact if there is some sort of emergency that requires you to, for example, maybe take somebody to hospital, a loved one to hospital, and you would need to bring them in the car if it merited that. So I think in terms of driving lessons and tests returning, you'll probably find that happens, but there will still be mitigations in terms of masks and PPE. But in terms of being in the car with somebody else, at the moment, I would say, out with those exemptions, that would still be a breach of the current regulations.
Okay, well, we'll move on to one of our favourite topics here, one that we'll probably talk about more and more as the weather gets better and we move into the summer months, but it's, of course, travel. We've talked about it before here on Coronavirus Catch-Up, but Richard, there's no mention of international travel in this plan that's been published by the executive, Gary. He's asking us where that leaves us on the travel front.
Yeah, so Boris Johnson's plan for England and for travel returning, he has said that international travel will not return before May 17th. So a lot of travel companies in England are pinning their hopes that it can return on that date and are operating based on that. But he is waiting for a report to be submitted next month in April so he can review what to do next. In terms of Northern Ireland, the executive says it does want international travel to return when it is safe and appropriate for it to do so, because they know that everyone wants to have a holiday of some sort. People love to get away. But they also know international travel is a key part of our economy, tourism a big driver for our economy and for employment. Now, when you look at this exit strategy in step 5 of the travel and tourism part of the document, it says planning for the future, and then it says planning for the return of leisure travel. So it doesn't explicitly say that is when it will return. It just says that is when they are planning to look at it and planning ahead. I think if you want to look at how the travel companies are faring, they've seen bookings go through the roof in terms of when the Prime Minister announced his plans in England, people wanting to go away maybe July, August, September. Locally, you may want to read into the fact that Ryanair today announced flights from Belfast City Airport to destinations in Europe, to Spain, Portugal and Italy. Those routes starting from June. So the Irish carrier may be hedging its bets that some sort of international travel for Northern Ireland residents could return by that point. But we come back to this same issue, and you'll get bored of us saying it. We just can't say because we don't have dates and we don't have any indicative dates. This will depend on the data the executive uses and how quickly they may progress through each step.
Well, Jane, as we know, there is that mandatory 10-day isolation period for anyone entering Northern Ireland from outside the common travel area. For a lot of people, that's going to be a major factor in whether or not they decide to go away this year. Grace has been in touch with us and she's asking if there's any word on when that mandatory isolation could be done away with.
We don't know. Again, sorry that we don't have a definitive answer on this. What I will say is when you look through the Pathway to Recovery document, there's no mention in there about any end to this mandatory self-isolation period. I mean, it's possible that they haven't even got that far in terms of thinking about that sort of thing yet, because remember, it only came into place for pretty much all international arrivals before Christmas. Now, prior to that, whenever people could travel last summer, if you remember, the government brought in these travel corridors, which basically exempted you from having to self-isolate if you were coming back from a country where the rate of infection was deemed to be pretty low. So maybe as time goes on, that's something that they might seek to restore and bring back in to allow people the flexibility to travel a little bit more. But the one thing I would stress is that we got a pretty big hint from Michelle O'Neill last week at the press conference when she was asked, would she be advising anybody to book a holiday at the minute? And she said no. So I think at the minute, that's where the advice is on this. It might change as time goes on, but for the moment, there's a question mark over it.
Well, feeling foreign travel, we've always got, holidaying at home. We had a question on Facebook there from Carol about caravans. Richard, what's the situation with people being able to visit a holiday home or a caravan, for instance?
Well, what we can definitively say is that will happen before international travel returns, because when you look at the plan for exiting lockdown, visiting your holiday home and visiting caravan sites, that is in step 3. But it is worth saying that caravan sites under step 3, they will, the shared facilities within the sites, they will not reopen at that point. That will happen in step 4 of travel and tourism. And when we do enter step 4, you'll see that while the facilities will reopen, hotels and B&Bs and other accommodation providers that were also allowed to open under step 3, they'll be able to offer basically their full range of services. So in step 4, you'll be able to go for a spa treatment at a hotel. Again, no dates, but what we can say is that you'll be able to holiday at home, go to your caravan, go to your holiday home, visit a hotel before you'll be able to do that abroad anyway.
Well, Richard, while I'm speaking to you, we've got this one in for you as well from Sam. Last November, we were told we'd all get a voucher to spend on the high streets. The idea behind it was to encourage shoppers back out to support local traders. Obviously, since then, we've gone back into lockdown and the vouchers were never given out. Sam's asking, do we know whatever happened to those vouchers, or have they just been forgotten about?
Well, they haven't been forgotten about because it is something that listeners text into our radio programmes and people get in touch with us about here on Coronavirus Catch Up. And in turn, then we contact the Department for the Economy, who are responsible for rolling out this voucher scheme. So it definitely hasn't been forgotten about. I think we're all keen to get our hands on it, to go do a bit of shopping on the high streets. But basically, this was announced in November, as you said, and the plan was to roll it out in early 2021. But of course, we then re-entered this really strict and extended lockdown, which has seen non-essential retail shut completely. Even click and collect services have been suspended. So the thinking from the Department of the Economy was, well, there's no point handing out a high street voucher to people when the shops aren't open and the health situation isn't great either, because these vouchers, they can't be used online. They are specifically for stimulating town centres and the high streets to encourage people to go out and help the really struggling and ailing retail sector. Now, the Economy Minister, Diane Dodds, just recently published her sort of recovery document, how she expects Northern Ireland's economy to get back up and running, how to breathe a bit of life back into the economy. And the voucher does feature, it says that the department will continue to develop this voucher in the new financial year, so when we get into April, and it will also still develop the holiday at home voucher, which is probably going to be about £50, and that will be issued through to each household, and you can use that for hotel discounts or for various other attractions that participate. So it hasn't been forgotten about. We haven't forgotten about it. I think people out there haven't forgotten about it because everybody wants to get their hands on it. There is a commitment that it will be worked on and rolled out. We just don't have a time frame for that as yet.
I think I've near mine spent already, and I haven't even got it yet. But
I think most of us do.
Yeah, I know. Well, before we go any further, I just want to come back to travel quickly. I've had this on Facebook from Barney. Jane, I'll maybe throw this one your direction. But he's asking about travel from GB to NI. Can we travel from GB to NI to be with someone in a bubble?
Yes, you can. I mean, ultimately, the advice at the moment is still that people should not be travelling unless it is essential. Now, before Christmas, the executive brought in guidance that anybody who's coming from Great Britain to Northern Ireland and is intending to stay for more than 24 hours should be self-isolating first for that 10-day period. That was just advice that came in. It wasn't an official travel ban. And obviously, if you're coming over and you're going to be forming part of a bubble with somebody, then I would imagine there's exemptions in there for people to be able to do that. So there was never a ban brought in, but I think people who are still coming over need to bear in mind the advice that already exists around travel and just taking into account whether your journey is essential or not.
Okay, well, lastly tonight, I thought we'd mention the live events industry. In England, all social distancing measures are due to be scrapped on the 21st of June, according to their lockdown exit plan. So we're hearing of festivals and large events being planned over there for the summertime. Richard, how are things looking for live events here in the summer months? Can we have the same optimism maybe as those in England have at the minute?
Well, the live event industry was hit really hard as a result of the pandemic, and even when we had a bit of respite last year and the hospitality sector reopened, live music was still banned. Now, the owner, or the organiser rather, of Belsonic, the festival that takes place in Belfast, he was on the radio earlier this week saying that they are still optimistic that they will be able to press ahead with their events in the late summer. They're still selling tickets, which indicates that they do seem to think something may happen. They say that they're looking at their other festivals that are taking place elsewhere, like Reading and Isle of Wight. They're planning to go ahead, and they're thinking, well, if that's going to happen, and if England is planning to be able to do this, including reopening nightclubs in and around June 21st, even if we are a couple of weeks or a month or so, if not a bit longer behind that, then something still could go ahead in August. So there was real optimism, but they were keen to also say, look, we only want to go ahead with these events if they are safe to do so, and all of this will depend on the health advice that Stormont has and the decisions made there. But it was a bit of optimism this week that you could find by late summer some sort of live events that we've all been missing could take place.
Well, tell me this before we go. Months down the line, or weeks, whatever it takes, whenever all the restrictions are done away with and we can kind of go back to normality, what's the first thing you'll be booking or doing when you can?
Well, can I just be open here, I'm gutted because I think I was on this programme last year, just after the pandemic began, and I was supposed to see Celine Dion.
Not the Celine Dion tickets again.
So, yeah, well, it was put back until April, and then I got a notification the other day to say it's been put back until 2022. So I've got that to look forward to very far in the distance. I think in the short term, I would just like to get my nails done because I've been painting my own nails for months now and I'm not very good at it. So as soon as the nail salon's open, I will be there.
There we go. Richard, you're heading to the nail salons too?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think for me, it'll be getting out for dinner or for a couple of drinks with friends, being able to hug my friends again because it's been so long now. It's so bizarre, and a little bit of sunshine. So I would love to get a trip away, but we'll see what happens.
Well, let's hope. Full of optimism for Jane's nails and Celine Dion and you getting a hug. But we'll have to leave it at that for this week. Thanks to Jane and Richard, of course, for coming on and taking us through all those questions. We've had reams of questions sent in to us this week. Lots of people with lots of questions. We haven't been able to get to them all tonight, but Jane is working on a piece for the BBC News NI website, which will be published at the weekend, which will answer more of your questions that we haven't had time to get to tonight. If you did take the time to get in touch with us, thanks for doing that. Hopefully the questions that we did answer will have explained to you the situation and will help you understand what's to come in the weeks ahead. Don't forget you can keep up to date with all the latest developments on the BBC News NI website, which you'll find at bbc.co.uk/newsni. And we're on social media as well. If you're on Facebook, you've probably found us already, but we're on Facebook and we're on Twitter, YouTube and Instagram as well. Just type in BBC News NI when you're on there and you should find us. But that's it from us for this week. We'll be back with another coronavirus catch up at the same time next week. I'll see you then. Stay safe.